Hello, welcome everybody. I'm Tom Goodyear. I'll be talking to you in this webinar about shifting priorities and how the asset manager can evaluate and prioritize the lowest carbon option for the retrofit. Just a couple of housekeeping points before we move on. This session is being recorded, and so if for any reason you have to leave, it will be available to you at a later point, or if you want to share it with anyone else at a later point, you'll have access to those recordings on our website. There is certainly going to be time for Q&A at the end after I finish the slide deck. And to participate in the Q&A, just tap your questions into the chat box, and they'll come through to myself and Karina, the organizer. And then we'll hope to get through them all. If we don't get through them all, then I'll follow up with you individually afterwards. But we'll make sure we get answers to your questions. Okay. So the agenda for the session this afternoon, I'll just introduce myself briefly. I will talk through classical capital programming. I'll talk about how asset management and capital planning work together. Ask about, well, do we even care about carbon and how do we include that? Move on to retrofit solutions specifically, and the role of the asset manager in all this. What can you do? And then just confirm the conclusions, highlights, and then move on to our Q&A session. So me, I'm an aerospace engineer. I first started off working for Balfour Beatty, doing construction management type work, project management. I became a project engineer, working particularly in the power sector. Also worked in rail, highways, aviation, and lots of big construction bids. Balfour Beatty acquired Parsons Brinckerhoff. I transferred into there, and then ended up on secondment into Her Majesty's Treasury here in the UK, working on infrastructure policy and how to bring down the cost of infrastructure. One of the things the industry kept telling us was asset management is a way to do that. So when I returned to the business, I created our rail asset management group. Shortly after that, I took a transfer out to the US. So I worked at WSP USA for 4 years, looking after all the asset management advisory work we did in the central part of the country. And then last summer, I returned to WSP in the UK as the head of strategic asset management. And so in that time, I've worked for quite a few different clients, many more than is listed there on the bottom. But there's some of those are crucial, and crucial examples of some of the kinds of activities I'll be talking about in this webinar. So capital programming, typically it's the process undertaken by a planning department or strategic planning department or something to that effect. Their role in this is to set and communicate out, to send the signals for the priorities for the organization in accordance with perhaps a strategic plan, a vision that might be articulated, the values or the objectives of the organization. And then they've got to funnel down all these potential concepts or filter down into a viable set of actual projects. And then define and run some kind of process to actually prioritize those potential investments. And so we often talk about that as a funnel, a capital projects funnel. So taking a large number of concepts and filtering and refining, plucking out the less viable opportunities as you go through development, design, construction, and obviously completion. So one of the ways that you often do this is using something called MultiCriteria Analysis. And to do this, you need to select some criteria that really reflect the values and the objectives of your organization. And then you can score those potential projects against those criteria. Sometimes particular clients might have mandated or required criteria that they have to use in this. And so in the USA, the two federal authorities, the FTA, the FHWA, they have some requirements that they expect their grant recipients to follow, including condition, accessibility, performance. The state of Illinois just passed some recent legislation with a longer list of things that have to be included. And here in the UK, we've had relatively stable requirements for a long time about what goes into business cases for central government funding. But very recently, we've seen a massive increase in the expectation that that you address social value in seeking central government funding. So, asset management and capital planning. So this is some of you might be aware of it. This is the 6-box model from the Institute of Asset Management, and I want to use it to talk about the crossover here. So we're talking about, in this model, the strategy and planning department, those who take those inputs and try and apply it to the way they make decisions about the asset's life cycle. So typically, the strategy and planning department, or people undertaking those roles, have to take information from the organizational strategic plan. They're taking information from the people that they work there with, and also information about the assets. And so some of the criteria that come out from that are an understanding of customer impact, potential legislative requirements, as we discussed, obviously having to be aware of the available funding, the capacity of the organization to actually undertake those roles, those projects, safety, obviously, and then whether the existing assets need to be replaced if they're becoming life expired, and then further, actually enhancements to the system or to the portfolio of assets to add capacity. But when we move on to talking about carbon, what are those criteria and where do they come from? So actually, there's a lot of places, there's a lot of criteria that are being leveled at these strategy and planning departments about carbon interests. So for example, customers, they are making it clear that they want to spend their money on low carbon products. Legislatures, we're seeing more and more legislatures around the world who are demanding that there are programs that reduce the impact of the infrastructure or the construction that's going on. Investors are voting with their feet or their dollars, demanding ESG reporting and directing some of their investments accordingly, aggressively sometimes. And then the commercial environment that we're working within, obviously there's an increasing cost of energy intensive products and processes. And all of that is getting entrenched into strategic plans of the organization. And so that's coming through into the strategy and planning departments. But also there's inputs coming from the organization itself, from the people that work there. One thing we see within our organization is that people are attracted to businesses or organizations where they feel their values align. And so as any kind of organization, you've got to be cognizant of what your staff, what your resources expect of you and what they think is important. And then also manufacturers. So manufacturers are creating and reporting more on the carbon impacts of their products, and that's another input for strategic planning departments to deal with. So carbon in a multi-criteria analysis. Qualitative analysis is a great place to start. It's a lot simpler. You can talk about the relative impacts of the relative carbon impacts of potential projects. And so in this very simple example here, I've just taken 3 potential options. And so when we're looking at carbon, and so the worst there is business as usual, or maybe even worse than business as usual. And so if a project has been evaluated against this criteria, if it meets that description of its traditional construction, the resulting energy use is the same or even increased energy use compared to business as usual or a traditional design, then we're going to give that project 0 on this category. But if there's some improvement on business as usual, that could mean things like the embodied carbon or the embodied carbon equivalent is lower. There's just a lower operational energy demand, or maybe you're somehow avoiding some of the operational energy associated with it, like transport. And so in this example, we're going to give this schema 1. But then best of all is achieving net 0 or better. That requires some understanding of what net 0 specifically means and probably some decent analysis to underpin that. But not in this case. We're just saying this is a relative thing to achieve. And so some of the examples could be things like renewable power generation and forestation, and you're sinking more carbon than the actual whole life carbon impact of the construction and the operations. And we want to really reward projects like that because that's meeting our ambitions. So in this case, we'll give it 3. And what that means is when you do this multi-criteria analysis of evaluating some potential projects A and B against some example criteria, you can see how you start to assign more credit to those projects that achieve your ambitions. This is all just relative. So what you can do is then move on to a quantitative analysis, and that's great. But to do quantitative analysis at the program level, you need to have some good analysis down at the project level. So those staff, those resources who are proposing the projects, they've then got to undertake some analysis to say, well, these are the carbon impacts of the project that I'm proposing or supporting. And so some of the things to keep in mind there are that you need really good benchmark data so that the competing staff in different departments who are all competing for those same dollars, they're using the same base, the same set of rules. But that's not difficult. There's existing tools you can use for that, proprietary ones, which we'll come on to in a moment. You also need acceptance that there are multiple scenarios of how you might deliver a particular project. And you're going to need to model those different scenarios and actually select the correct one, the one that you want to include in your analysis, and then undertake some sensitivity analysis on that. But that's not anything new and exciting. That's exactly what we do with benefit cost ratios at the moment and other financial modeling tools. You're going to need to provide some very clear guidance on calculation constraints. And so I mentioned before about definitions, right? So what does whole life even really mean for modeling? And this is just about establishing those boundary conditions. Are you modeling 10, 20, 50, 100 years, 120 years in some cases? And then finally, you also need to have some consideration of what the absolute and relative impacts of schemes are, because some schemes, even if you do them in a traditional way, their overall impact is going to be very minimal, like a fencing project, one of my colleagues mentioned. But if you're looking at a very, very large scheme, even a modest improvement is going to make a significant contribution to reducing carbon for your organization. And so I think you could set up multiple criteria to try and balance that out. I think in reality, you just need to retain some discretion in the way that you award the marks in a multi-criteria analysis here. So I mentioned some of those tools. These are some of the tools that we use within our organization when doing carbon modeling. It is a whole new profession in its own right. One of the tools that we use internally on projects is one-click LCA. It's wonderful, wonderful product for helping you estimate the impact of projects based on whatever information you might have available about materials you're going to use, how the project will go, that kind of thing. SACE Asset Management is a particularly for local authority highways. And one of the new modules it's got in it is the ability to report on all these potential schemes, all those rows there, and the potential carbon impacts of undertaking those schemes to be used when you're trying to figure out what your long-term program is going to be. The RSSB has also made a freely available tool. That's the Rail Safety Standards Board here in the UK. And it's got some great benchmark data in there about rail projects, and so you can use minimal amounts of information about a potential rail sector project to help you model the impacts there. And then PAS 2080, publicly available specification, that's used to help guide someone through a calculation for whole life carbon impacts. So moving on to retrofit solutions. So just 4 statements that we'll be really clear about here. So 80% of the buildings that are expected to exist in 2050 have already been built. So any net zero ambitions for 2050 have to keep that in mind. Here in the UK construction sector, these estimates vary a lot, but it's responsible for 35 to 40% of the UK carbon emissions. And finally, 50% of the buildings that exist in the world in 2040 need to be retrofitted to zero carbon standards. That's not very far away, and that's a lot of buildings, of course. So putting all that together, what we know is we need less construction, we need to use less material, and or we need large improvements in both. But in amongst all that, we've got to get much more efficient buildings. So how do we do that? Well, retrofit is the answer, and that's not a new answer from me. This is there's plenty of campaigning going on right now. WSP has had its own campaign, Rethink Retrofit, in the last couple of years, and the Architects Journal here in the UK, they're still pushing a campaign called Retro First, and there's a lovely quote that accompanies it, also a slogan. The greenest building is the one that already exists, which is of course true. And aside from the carbon benefits, one really, really important thing there is the heritage benefits of undertaking retrofits and maintaining, for example, beautiful old buildings. Now, the carbon impacts of retrofit. Now, foundations and structures account for most of the embodied carbon in projects. And so we have some research here on the right, which is talking about that those potential carbon equivalent emissions, depending on the types of projects you undertake. And just in relative terms, you can see there that large, heavy buildings, those where you've got significant structure and substructure, those are the ones that have by far the greatest embodied carbon. Small light buildings, better, but by far the best is renovations. And therefore, like-for-like refurbishments are going to embody far less CO2 equivalent than a new build. And therefore, retrofit schemes should typically score highest against a carbon criterion in a multi-criteria analysis. And therefore, to my mind, that means that a retrofit is typically going to be prioritized if you include it as such in one of these analyses. So what's the role of the asset manager in all this? Well, who is an asset manager? I would argue that it's really anyone making decisions about how to manage assets, right? And that really is in an organization that manages assets, that's anyone from a chief executive all the way down to frontline technicians and operatives. So they're all making some kind of decisions about what they do and how they manage the assets on a day-to-day basis. I would suggest that just encourage your organization to take some steps, baby steps or big leaps, to follow their stated values and objectives. Almost all organizations have made some statements in recent years about climate emergencies or just how important their environmental impact is to them. Therefore, think about and try to develop some simple processes within your control about how to make it easy for people to include consideration of carbon impacts. And after all, that really just means doing what you said you would do, helping your organization to be accountable to itself. You've said these are your priorities, and let's hold ourselves to that. So in conclusion, just my key takeaways. Capital programming simply means prioritizing the capital projects that best meet your business goals. Carbon reduction is now, often explicitly, one of those goals. Considering the carbon impact of projects, it can be rough and easy, quick and dirty. It doesn't need to be difficult. It can be a relative thing, or there's plenty of tools and support out there to actually do detailed and accurate calculations. Retrofit solutions, assuming that they are like-for-like delivery of the benefits, will often score best on carbon impacts and therefore get prioritized up in a capital programming process. And simple processes are going to help asset managers to prioritize those projects that help us all meet our net zero ambitions. So finally, just a parting thought before Q&A. This is the fourth webinar in a series on asset management, our third global series. So we've got these 5 remaining ones available at that link. Don't need to try and type it down or type it out or anything right now. It will come to you on a courtesy email after this. Which brings us on to questions. Okay. We had 6 come in. Right, first one. So what if the retrofit option cannot deliver the benefits needed, such as usable space? Well, I think I think that's a tough one, because I think with a retrofit solution, an old building, perhaps, that they are designed to very different standards with different amounts of usable space, just for different purposes from a different time. There are lots of examples out there where some very innovative approaches have been taken to adjust the structures to create more open space, but also, I think it's okay if the benefits aren't like for like. I think if you're looking to hold true to the values of the organization, then if you're weighing up options, it may well be that the retrofit does not offer the same or quite the same commercial benefit, but it does hit much higher on the carbon or any of the other criteria you might find are important, and I think that's fine. If that means that the retrofit option is not one that's viable, that's fine too. You need to do what is best for your business. My only suggestion is that in undertaking these kinds of analyses, you're giving carbon impacts a chance to be considered. Okay. What about organizations that don't do any multi-criteria analysis? I would argue that any organization that has a capital program is doing some multi-criteria analysis. It might not be very formal. It might be quite qualitative and relative. But there will be a certain number of criteria that are being considered when selecting which projects get prioritized. It might be that that's not very formal, not very formalized. If it's not very formalized, there's opportunities to influence and lobby if that's an appropriate thing to do. I would say, in my opinion, you want to move towards a place where you do have a formal process and your organization is explicit about what it wants to achieve through its capital program for external transparency, but also internal auditability. Can we assign a cost for carbon emissions to help with the analysis? Yes, you absolutely can. I would say it's a different cost. You could there are multiple different places you can obtain a carbon cost from, and governments have them set at different rates around the world. Different organizations, if they're quite large and they do this kind of consideration, they have different numbers, different reference numbers they use. If you want to include the effects of carbon in an economic model, then yes, you need to convert it into something monetary, and you can use those figures to do so. For a simple multi-criteria analysis like we've been discussing, you don't need to. You can set out your own guidance as to what a high, medium, and low scoring potential project might be. Are there simple methods to evaluate transportation project alternatives, such as improvements to a bike lane versus a transit project? Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I would say that multi-criteria analysis should be very helpful with this. Sometimes certain organizations have different streams of multi-criteria analysis depending on the scale of the projects. So, for instance, bike lane projects are typically inexpensive, right? So you might have an entirely different way of evaluating them and a different budget pot that they draw from. But if you want to consider them on if you want to weigh them against one another on a like-for-like basis, then you need to set out the criteria you're going to use, which could include total cost, or it could be more benefit cost ratios. But the point is, a bike lane is going to appear to be easily funded, and depending on how you choose to include considerations of affordability, if everything else is like for like, a bike lane is going to get the nod a lot quicker than a significant transit project. But it really just comes down to how you set up your analysis, and again, for those smaller, lighter schemes, maybe you have an entirely different process for funding them. One more. High aspirations don't survive the business case at my organization. Any tips on how I can still influence things? Yes, I think if it's too difficult to bring these kind of considerations, these kind of topics up to the board level, or the level at which those massive capital project decisions are being made, then you can operate at a lower level. You can create arguments, and you can create arguments around how the low carbon options are the ones that meet the ambitions of the organization, and it might be that you can't influence that at those highest levels, but you can lower down, for example, at the project analysis level. So if you're working on the development of options for a particular outcome you're trying to achieve, then within that project team, you can look to promote the lower carbon options. Even if you encounter hostility, you can still work to include some kind of analysis of or some kind of consideration, even if unasked for, about what the potential benefits might be within this realm. But it's sometimes, often, not going to be the most important thing, and that's fine. Okay, right. Well, we've reached our 30-minute allowance, and yeah, thank you everyone for attending. Like I said, you'll get a courtesy email after this with the relevant links to the recording. You might have seen that you can download the slides at the moment through the box that's on the side, and yes, you'll receive something from us soon. So thank you everyone for attending, and Karina's going to close the webinar.